Well, today I want to talk to you about the best practices and guiding principles behind social entrepreneurship, and how actually they're everywhere that we look. It's simply a question of being observant. And I know that when we think about, excuse me. When we think about supporting and working with marginalized communities, oftentimes it can be very intimidating. And what I hope is that when you walk out of here today, you're a little bit less intimidated and feel a little bit more empowered. First of all, I know that oftentimes when we think about just the term social entrepreneurship, it can be a little bit elusive. And so what I thought I'd do is just give a very quick and dirty definition of it. There's a Supreme Court justice who once said about pornography, I can't necessarily describe it, but I know it when I see it. Now, social entrepreneurship, to be clear, has nothing to do with pornography. However, it's oftentimes the same case. Okay, so I think a good way to think about it and to look at the definition of social entrepreneurship is to take the two words and to break them down, and then to draw a distinction and see how they come together. So first, if we think about the who. In typical business entrepreneurship, who are the priority beneficiaries? It's the owners, it's the shareholders. In social, it's vulnerable communities, marginalized populations. The what? Think about indicators of success. What are the indicators of success for business entrepreneurship? It's increased profitability, increased shareholder value. In social, it's social impact. Okay. In anything that we do, we're driven by our indicators of success. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that entrepreneurs are driven by profit motive or driven by money. I think that's actually rarely the case. And it doesn't mean that these things are mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that you can't create a social enterprise, for example, and focus on both sets of beneficiaries and both indicators of success. The simple point is that oftentimes you have to make difficult decisions and you have to make difficult choices. And your indicators of success and your beneficiaries, your target beneficiaries, are going to drive those decisions. Okay. But what about the how? And this is where they come together. Because you think about entrepreneurship is an approach. It's about a way of doing things. It's about persistence and innovation, creativity. It's about not letting things die, never saying no. Right? It's about risk-taking. So when we put social in front of the word entrepreneurship, all we're talking about is taking those entrepreneurial qualities, taking what drives entrepreneurs, and applying that to helping marginalized communities increase their social impact, better their lives. It's about basically saying, there's a problem, I think I have a solution for that problem, and I'm going to work my tail off to try to figure out how to solve it, and how to scale it, and how to engage with others to solve that problem in a larger way. The other question is, when I think about the relative expert, social entrepreneurship, you're the relative expert, what does that mean? Well, I started, as Dennis spoke to, I started my career in social entrepreneurship 11 years ago tomorrow actually, when I landed in Guatemala as a Peace Corps volunteer. And when I arrived for the first couple of weeks, all of my colleagues would have this question for our trainers continuously. And it was basically an exasperation of how am I going to help people? What do I know? How can I help institutions or businesses that have been around and doing this for 20 years? I was certainly anxious about that, but a little bit less concerned because I had been working in business and investment banking for 10 years. I was 31 at the time. I was definitely the old guy in the room. But the continuous answer of the Peace Corps and the trainers was, don't worry about it. You are the relative expert. And they were right. When you think about leading development work, and social entrepreneurship in particular, it's not necessarily about the technical content. It's much more about the guiding principles, the best practices. You don't have to know how to design a water system necessarily. You don't have to know how to give an HIV training talk. You don't have to know how to plant seeds. You can learn those things, or you can engage others who know how to do those things as a part of your team. It's about knowing the principles behind what makes things work. And we see those everywhere. We see those in the arts, we see those in science, we see those in media and TV and movies every day. It's simply a question of being deliberately observant and taking the best practices from one thing and seeing how they translate to another. And that certainly works in social entrepreneurship. So I want to take a few minutes and talk about what I see as 5 guiding principles of social entrepreneurship and how they fit into this being the relative expert and how they come from things that you actually know and see every day. So know your desired outcome and be true to your desired outcome. This is foundational. You have to know exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve for your beneficiaries and with your beneficiaries, and stick to it. Well, I was talking to my daughter Ava Luna the other day about The Wizard of Oz. And if there was ever an example of how knowing your desired outcome, there's no place like home, right? And being true to your desired outcome, no matter what, and how that drives success, then I would say The Wizard of Oz is actually it. That Dorothy was confronted with flying monkeys and a winding yellow brick road and some psychotic green lady getting in her path all the time. But she stuck to it and she succeeded. Social entrepreneurship is about being Dorothy. Channel your inner Dorothy. Try not to have your house land on someone, but channel your inner Dorothy. In our work, it's all about creating access for the first time to essential products and services in communities in the developing world. The way that we do that is we empower, train, and support women entrepreneurs to go out to these villages and sell products and services and earn a profit. And we engage with volunteers from Social Entrepreneur Corps, our program where students go down and support these entrepreneurs. And they gain experience. But even if these are, so to speak, our Tin Men and our Lion and our Scarecrow that all benefit from this, the only reason that they do so is because we're true to our desired outcome and we stick with it. Simple solutions for complex problems. Poverty, obviously, and the problems behind it are very complex. And oftentimes we try to come up with very complex solutions for these complex problems. But oftentimes it's the simple solutions that are actually the ones that work. If you look at the better mousetrap isn't a better mousetrap. Why? Because it's hard to understand, because it's hard to replicate, because it's expensive, because if one thing breaks, the whole thing breaks. Try to keep it simple wherever you can. How did David fell the great Goliath? With a sling. How had probably billions of pounds of mozzarella cheese been kept off of the tops of pizza boxes? with the pressure guard. I actually had to look that up myself. Look at these 2 photos. After the initial launches of the space shuttle, the NASA rocket scientists tried to figure out how can we carve some weight off of the space shuttle? New polymers, new fibers, what have you. And some guy raised his hand and said, what if we don't paint the external fuel tank? I think that saved about 800 pounds. A simple solution, a seemingly complex problem. In our work, when we were thinking about how to help entrepreneurs overcome uncertainty and get out to communities and sell things that people hadn't gotten before, we simply thought, well, what if they bought the raw materials after they sold it and not before it? And it worked. Set something in motion. Social entrepreneurship is by nature a means and not an ends. And so it's a journey. So you have to take the first step. Get up and get something going. Social entrepreneurship is fundamentally about trying to create systems change. But I would contend that most social entrepreneurs, when they first start out, don't know what that systems change is going to look like, or they're not thinking about systems change. They simply see a problem, look to address that problem, find a solution, see that it's a universal problem, and say, how can I take this solution I have and make it a universal solution? Yeah? And oftentimes it's not even the original social entrepreneur who actually creates the systematic impact. There's a network effect where others enhance it and modify it and take it to the next level. Yeah? What comes from, at the heart of it is that inspiration comes from action, and not vice versa. If you think about how was that guy able to raise his hand and help the space shuttle break orbit, well, it's because 80 years earlier, 2 bicycle mechanics in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, had set something in motion, literally and figuratively. Apple computers started in a garage with what we'd see as a simple machine today. There were no visions of iPhones. It was science fiction at the time, but they started something. In our work, I started by opening up a restaurant in 2003 to try to create some jobs. We donated the profits to a local stove project. We saw that that wasn't sufficient, so we said, well, why don't we try to create a local business? If you look at Mohammed Yunus in microcredit, he took $27 out of his own pocket, loaned it to 42 women. They all paid him back. He said, oh, this works. Why don't I try to do more of it? Created the Grameen Bank. And now you have thousands of organizations around the world that are practicing microcredit and improving upon it, a network effect. But it started with a very simple thing. So don't be intimidated. Get from the symptoms to the problems. Social entrepreneurship and being effective in designing strategies is essentially about asking why and why and why and why. Going from symptom, and what's the symptom of that symptom, and the symptom of that symptom, to get to the problem, the root cause, and come up with the solution. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the story about Van Halen, and I think Aerosmith as well. When they were going to a new concert site, they would send along a long list of instructions. And within those instructions, it would say, when we show up, there has to be a bowl of M&Ms, and all the brown M&Ms have to be removed. Yeah? Now you thought, well, what about your prima donnas? Yeah, but the concept was if they showed up and there were brown M&Ms, that was symptomatic of something. The fact that people probably hadn't read all of the instructions in great detail. And so they need to go back and check the lighting, check the staging to make sure that something didn't happen. Yeah? They found a little symptom to try to get to a bigger problem. But it doesn't have to be that complex. We know this instinctively. Yeah? Think about dating. You go out on a date with a guy, and he talks too much. Yeah? Or he doesn't tip. Or he doesn't open the door for you. Sorry about this, guys. Yeah? Probably a problem there. Maybe not somebody you want to hang out with. I'm not sure. Right? There's another Ashoka fellow in Kenya named Moses Muzasi. And he learned that Kenyan women young women were not completing school, were not completing high school. Symptom. They weren't showing up for a few days a month, and then they'd fall behind and they'd stop coming altogether. Symptom. There was no access to sanitary napkins. Problem. He created a manufacturing facility to manufacture low-cost sanitary napkins. Now Kenyan women are going to school. It's counterintuitive. Think about those solutions. Microcredit. Poor people will pay back more than wealthy people. Sanitary napkins help people to get an education. So much of this work is counterintuitive. That's why it works, and that's why oftentimes people also think it's a crazy idea to begin with. But most of what we have to do is disabuse ourselves of what we think up front and try to learn and think that there may be a counterintuitive solution. The co-founder, George Glickley, and myself, we have something we call the Costanza Rules. And anybody you watch Seinfeld? Yeah? All right, good. All right. There's an episode in Seinfeld where George walks into the diner and he sits down and he says to Jerry, you know what, everything I've ever tried to do in my life has been wrong. So from here on out, whatever my intuition is, I'm just going to do the opposite. And after a little bit of time, he goes up to the counter, and there's a beautiful woman, and she turns around, and he says, hello, my name is George. I'm balding. I live with my parents, and I don't have a job. And she says, how you doing? So think about being counterintuitive. It's not always the approach that you would think is the one that works. In our work, what we do is train women to provide services that people before only thought doctors could provide or professionals could provide. What did we learn? Well, we learned that in order for them to be effective, they have to go to other communities. It doesn't work so well in their own community to begin with. So In order for people to trust me, I have to go places where people don't know me. Counterintuitive. That's constantly something that we're looking at, it's constantly something that we're learning. Martin Luther King, we just honored him this past Monday, and probably one of the greatest social entrepreneurs of all time. Taking from Mahatma Gandhi, if somebody hits you, don't hit them back. Somebody uses violence towards you, don't respond in kind. And that created systematic change. If you think about Martin Luther King, think about what he achieved and all of those great things. Yeah? But when you think about social entrepreneurship, think about how he did it. He had a clear desired outcome, and he stuck to it. He had a relatively simple solution. It was scalable. It wasn't a better mousetrap. He understood that racism is a symptom of other problems. And he set something in motion. And that motion continues today. So when you look at going out and working with communities and social entrepreneurship, don't be intimidated. Look around and find best practices in obvious and not very obvious places. You can apply them to your work. You can become the relative expert, then you get out and you get experience and you become more of an expert. But the whole point is don't be intimidated, empower yourself so that you can go and empower others. Thank you.